Hi everyone. We're going to take a short lecture to talk about the idea of the cultural landscape by looking at a number of different cultural landscapes. Most of the examples I've chosen for you today are from outside of the United States because a good amount of variety helps us understand some of these differences, and because a lot of the class will be focused on American cultural landscapes. But my goal here tonight is to teach you about the idea of the cultural landscape and how we can apply the idea of a cultural landscape to think geographically about a place. Let's get started. I'll get my head out of the way. There we go, that's better. So here we go into this idea of the cultural landscape, or looking at cultural landscapes. First of all, a definition of the cultural landscape is any landscape or any environment that has been modified by human activity. That's very broad. We're talking about anything that humans have done to change the world. That makes a cultural landscape. The reason we find that a valuable idea in geography is because the changes that people make to the landscape reflect their culture. It reflects their values and their beliefs, things like their sense of identity, their sense of race or ethnicity, their identification in a religious way. All of their values and beliefs and elements of culture get expressed on the landscape. And then, if there's people there, we can read their culture as they wear it as well. But even if a landscape is missing its people, we can put on our cultural landscape lenses, our cultural landscape viewing glasses, and see the culture that built it, which is really an interesting way to think about the differences between places as well as some similarities between places. Let's look at a few examples. All right, so here is a cultural landscape. Before all of these things were built here, there would have been just a flat area. But now we see streets, we see sidewalks, we see street lights, we see a few trees, but not very many trees, and far more towers of, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. I forgot I'm small, I'm not in the way. Far more of these towers of steel and concrete and glass, sometimes called skyscrapers, sometimes just called office buildings. Collectively, everything we see here makes this landscape something that everyone recognizes right away, even if you don't know where it is, even if you have not any idea where it is. Collectively, we all know that this is a city, right? It's obvious. It's a city. It has all the things that make a city a city. A lot of people close together, so density, a lot of tall buildings in close together buildings, a transportation network to move all those people around, a lot of concrete and pavement, very little open space and greenery. So that's a city. We know it's a city right away. That's a cultural landscape. However, is it a city that is familiar to us? Do we recognize the city? For most of you, probably not, because this is a city in South America. This is called Santiago in the country of Chile. And it's a somewhat familiar city to people in South America, but it's probably not familiar to everyone. Yet we all recognize that it makes up a city. Oh, what happened to my... There we go. This is a scene from within Santiago. I want to point out something that sometimes we get confused about what is part of a cultural landscape, what is not part of a cultural landscape. So it's easy to understand that the streets and the buses and the buildings are all part of the cultural landscape because they were built by people that applied their culture. But here is a river in the middle of Santiago, and it too is a cultural landscape. And see if you can think for a minute about what makes this river part of the cultural landscape. Because isn't a river a natural thing? What would make a river part of the cultural landscape? if you answered that the river has been changed, specifically there's these channels put in place along the banks to prevent it from moving outside of its bank to keep it channelized, then you're exactly right. The river has been modified by human activity to behave a little bit less like a natural river and a little bit more the way humans want it to behave. So it too is a cultural landscape. Another element of the cultural landscape when we look at a city or any place are elements of language. Sometimes we can only hear the language that's spoken. That's a part of the cultural landscape. But sometimes we have visual cues like this. First of all of you should recognize that this is a Starbucks coffee restaurant being started, because Starbucks has a globally recognized symbol with English language dominant. But also there's this other language here, and that gives us a clue about the kind of people who live here, the kind of people who are building this location, the kind of people that will be its customers. And that is, pronto aquí, we can tell that these people speak Spanish. So we know it's a Starbucks, but we also have more information about where it might be. It's in a Spanish-speaking country. So that's part of the insight we can get from looking at the cultural landscape. The other thing that cultural landscapes reflect are very often the values of the people who build the landscapes. This is an example of the Lincoln Memorial. The statue of Lincoln here is in the middle. This is in Washington, D.C., in the capital of the United States. This is a memorial to President Lincoln. The statue of Lincoln is inside here. But what I want to point out is not that there's a statue to an important person. That is important to the cultural landscape. The people we build statues of reflect the dominant society's values, right? You don't build statues of people that are villains. You build statues of people who are heroes. But in this case, what I want to point out are these Greek-style columns on the outside of the Lincoln Memorial. And what this is saying is that there is a cultural value placed upon the history of Greek thought, Greek philosophy, Greek civilization. Now, the Greeks had an early civilization, but not the only civilization. And so the choice of building a really important monument to an important American hero, but making it look like ancient Greece, was, first of all, a very deliberate choice, and second of all, a very clear statement of the values of the people who designed it, built it, funded it, supported it. A city skyline is sometimes more recognizable, sometimes less recognizable. It's always a cultural landscape, but recognizing which city it is can be a little bit of a challenge. Most of you probably have recognized this city already, but a lot of my domestic students, a lot of my Washington students have a tough time figuring out what city this is. Some say it's New York, some say it's Chicago, and then I show them the next picture, just taking the camera and turning, and they go, oh yeah, that's Seattle. So sometimes there are really distinctive features of a cultural landscape. Like in this case, the Space Needle is really an obvious distinctive feature that makes Seattle skyline very obvious. The Space Needle silhouette is a very distinctive, iconic aspect of what makes Seattle a unique place. But all these other buildings are also part of the cultural landscape of Seattle. So one more view on that. Sports and the way they're played and the spaces that we use for sports are part of the cultural landscape. You can tell that these gentlemen are playing cricket. If you recognize the sport, so you can tell that this is a place that had a history of British colonialism, more likely than not. That's part of the cultural legacy of the British Empire, was to export, to diffuse its sports outside of the region. That was in India. Football is much more culturally universal. This happens to be in Ecuador. In the United States, of course, we say soccer, not football, but this happens to be in Ecuador. So we see that space is used for sporting events variously around the world. Some places it's more likely to see baseball fields. Some places it's very hard to find a baseball field, for example. Soccer fields or football fields are fairly ubiquitous, fairly common everywhere in the world. And there are also cultural landscapes that reveal the religious cultural influences of a place. Some of you might recognize this right away as a scene from Japan. This is from the western coast of Japan, somewhere close to Niigata. I think it might have been in Niigata prefecture, but I'm not positive. I'd have to look up exactly where I was when I took it. Anyway, here we see the impact of Shintoism on the landscape. That's quite common in Japan to see small Shinto shrines, sometimes large Shinto shrines, and these kami gates put around the landscape for the observance of Shintoism in the landscape. Shintoism is a good example of a religious practice. It's very place-based. We don't see this very often outside of Japan, but in Japan it's hard to go very far without seeing the impact of Shintoism. Another example of the religion's impact on the cultural landscape. This is a cemetery, so the way we bury the dead changes from culture to culture based on dominant religious practices. And Catholicism, it's very important for Catholics to bury the dead, but the dead being buried deep in the ground is not so important as long as they are entombed in a safe location. What's important too is to be near your family members when in your tomb. And so this is a cemetery in Ecuador where you can see these little buildings that are built, right? They're built like little office towers or high rises. And each niche holds the bones of a different family member, and the entire little building is for a family member. So again, this is probably not something that everyone sees when they walk down the street, but it's quite common in Catholic-dominated countries, especially those in Latin America. Moving on, the idea of religious impressions on the landscape or religious cultural landscapes. Here we have a scene in northern India, far northern India, right up against China, the Tibetan region of China, where Buddhism is practiced. And up here on this mountaintop above the city, there is a Buddhist shrine and a spot for monks to go and meditate. So the monastery is down here in the bottom, but then there's this building up here where monks go and they'll spend a few days or a week up there fasting and meditating as part of their religious practice. I want to take a minute. I've been pointing out all these differences. I want to take a minute to bring us back together too and look at some examples of cultural universals. The classroom you see here. I don't think any one of you looked at this and thought, what is that? I don't recognize that. Most of you looked at this and said, that's a classroom. Maybe not a classroom like the one you went to school, but we all recognize this as a classroom. So while we're emphasizing little differences sometimes, and sometimes big differences, I also want to bring us together and say, there are a lot of things that we value together and that we build in similar ways that reflect our values as a greater humanity, as a greater culture. The foods we eat and the way we prepare them is part of our cultural landscape. A lot of this has expression in various ethnicities, different ethnic identities, different backgrounds bring different food traditions with them. We also see some interactions of local food customs and globalizing food brands, in this case a McDonald's from India. In this example, we see that all the menu items down here are vegetarian or chicken-based. There's no beef, where beef burgers are a big part of the American McDonald's experience. Here in India, there's a big reflection of local cultural values onto a global company's menu. The first thing we'll be talking about in class as part of our cultural landscape appreciation is some elements of urban geography. That is the study of cities. So anytime we look at a city, there's lots of questions we can ask, like how do people live? How do people work? How is the city organized? Are there areas that are poor and areas that are rich? Are areas all spread out, or are there clusters? Do people live all together, or are there people separated by race or class or some other element? So we ask all these questions. We get very interested in urban geography. There's no end to it. But looking through this lens of a cultural landscape gives us a great tool to say the people who built this must have valued this and this and this, and it doesn't look like they valued that and that and that. Let me give you a quick example here. This, by the way, is Jamie the squirrel. He's the Social Science Division's mascot. And he comes along on trips with me, and I'll take pictures of him and just hold him up and take a picture of him. I don't have a picture of this without Jamie in it. So this is a 3-story tall bicycle parking garage in Amsterdam. What this cultural landscape tells me is that people don't like to drive. People don't like having to drive. It tells me that the people who designed the city wanted to design the city to be easy to get around on a bicycle and hard to get around in a car. And it tells me that a lot of people get to and from work or the train station by bicycle, because look at how many bikes there are here. If I look at a town like Auburn, Washington, for example, what I see people who value driving above almost everything else. It's as if we build our cities in the United States for cars, not for people, but for cars. What I see in Amsterdam is a city that's built for people and not built for cars. That's what this cultural landscape viewpoint helps us see, is the values that people bring then affect the environment that we all live in. One more theme we'll be exploring as part of urban geography is inequality. This is a city of a really poor, starving child in India that I just snapped a photo of him. He was sleeping on the stairway and obviously exhausted in the middle of the day. And then on the way out of India, I stopped and saw this duty-free zone, and I was just struck by the contrast between rich and poor. Cultural landscapes have different ways of dealing with poverty and wealth, and it's an interesting thing to explore. We all have different approaches to this, I recognize. Some of us are very compassionate about the poor. Some of us say, well, the poor are the poor and we'll always have them. I'm not going to be too strongly opinionated about that, except for to say that we have a big problem today in the Puget Sound region around Seattle and Tacoma and Auburn with homelessness and poverty. And that's been a really big issue in my neighborhood. We'll explore some of these issues around it in our first unit when we talk about gentrification and some of the related issues around the neighborhood of White Center. The clothing we wear is part of the cultural landscape. So whether women cover their heads out of modesty or not, for example, is a cultural feature. And we'll see in some places and we don't see as much in other places. This happens to be back in northern India. These women are Buddhist. We do see this commonly too for Muslim women. We also see it commonly for Orthodox Christian women in Eastern Europe when they're going to church in particular. So there's some cultural universals around some of these cultural habits that we sometimes think are distinctive to a place but are more common. Last but not least, when we talk about a cultural landscape and the people that are in it, we don't just mean the buildings, the streets, the cars or the bikes, the people's clothing, the languages they speak. We sometimes mean the people themselves. And a big theme to explore with respect to American cities is the diversity of American cities. We have a huge different ethnic mix in American cities compared to a lot of other places. This photo was taken in one of the places that has the most immigrants as a proportion of the population, or one of the most. I don't want to say the most. I think there might be one more, but it's pretty high. This is Doha, Qatar. And my time in Doha was very short, but the entire time I traveled in Doha, I didn't meet anybody who was from Qatar. I only met immigrants. And the reason for that is because everybody who works in a store or works in a barber shop like this one, or works at the airport, or works cleaning the streets or does anything outside are immigrants that the Qataris have paid to bring in. This man and his friend were both from Bangladesh. He had a wife and children back in Bangladesh. He earned enough money that he was supporting his family at home, but he could only afford to fly home to visit them every other year. I found that to be really striking and really powerful, that this man was willing to work in a place where he lived in an apartment with 6 other men. They, slept in cramped quarters, and just, he was away from his family. They were all away from their families, but this is what he was doing to make more money than he would possibly make in Bangladesh. It was really, really interesting to think about. In the United States, too, we have communities like my own community that have a large number of migrants, recent migrants to them. And the cultural landscape is one of recent migrants, of people coming from Latin America and Asia in particular. So we'll explore that as we go. Here's some more of that contrast between the rich and the poor. These are some Qatari people, and I didn't meet them. I just took a photo of them from a long ways away. But we see the skyline of Doha in the distance, and these women and their children enjoying the beach. Notice the women are dressed in a very conservative way, even though they're in the water, because of the religious practice that they follow. Let's do a little bit of landscape analysis. This is our last slide. Now let's put on our cultural landscape goggles and take a look at this. And what do we see? We see, I'm going to wait for you to come up with some ideas. The first thing you might have noticed, that stood out to me anyway, is this car is on the wrong side of the road from the United States and Europe and a lot of the rest of the world, but it's on the right side of the road for Britain, Japan, and British colonies around the world. Now, I don't think this is Japan, so I'm going to guess this was a former British colony. The other thing that probably stood out to you is if you look at everybody over here, we don't know what their ethnicity is from a photo because we don't have an idea about what language they speak or about what foods they eat, but we do have some racial cues. We can tell the race of these people is black because their skin is very dark toned and their hair is relatively short and curly. So we have a racial name for these people. So the combination of driving on the left-hand side and black skin, and then the last thing we can tell is we have some clues here about wealth or poverty. And the fact that there's so many people standing here on the side of the road is in okay condition, but the edges here are a little indistinct, tells us this is probably a developing country. And these people are probably waiting for a ride here with their bags. So a lot of people standing on the side of the road, a place that's likely to be Africa because of the race of the people, and driving on the left-hand side helps us say this is a place in Africa that was a former British colony. And now we know a lot more about this place by just looking at the cultural landscape, putting on those cultural landscape lenses and looking at the world. I hope that's an interesting way to think about the world. I hope you're going to practice that the rest of your life, but especially this quarter. And that's all I have for you right now. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know or ask me during office hours. I'm always happy to talk with you about that. That's all for now. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.